Regret? Probably not, because this is how the Brewers operate. They say it's how they have to operate. Whether you agree with that or not, it's the way they go about things. Remember when they traded Josh Hader a couple years ago? Now they've learned from that, and they don't do that in the middle of the season when they're in first place.
Yeah, that didn't work out. So well.
Notice how they kept Adames and they kept Devin Williams and all these other guys this year. It's difficult because, like, sure, the Brewers really could use Corbin Burnes this season, and their postseason outlook probably looks a bit different.
Welcome into another edition of On the Record. As always, my name is Jesse Friedman, and we are here to preview this weekend series for the Arizona Diamondbacks. Of course, it's the Diamondbacks and the Brewers, the first time these two teams have met this season. And here joining us in studio for the very first time, our first ever in-studio guest for On the Record is the one and only Curt Hogg, who covers the Brewers for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Curt, thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, you guys are well located downtown. Yeah, right on the way to the ballpark.
There you go.
Pop in, do an interview, go watch some baseball. Let's do it.
Curt is apparently in very high demand when it comes to the baseball podcasting community. He was on Foul Territory, I believe, just a few moments ago. He was on Baseball Barbacast like a couple of days ago. So we were just frankly very jealous that Curt was showing up on all these other shows.
It's not reflective of me. It's reflective of the baseball team, and specifically a 20-year-old that they have playing for them.
Yes, and we will talk about that 20-year-old here in a moment. But first, I want to go back to the last time that the Diamondbacks played the Brewers, which of course is very memorable for Diamondbacks fans, maybe less so for Brewers fans. But it was very quick, Curt. We were talking about this before hopping on, that like neither of us really remember covering that series because it felt like it happened so quickly. But I'm curious, just in the aftermath of that series, like how were the Brewers kind of explaining that internally? How were they kind of making sense of what happened in that series?
Well, the Brewers are on this streak of playing terribly in the playoffs.
Yeah.
So it's explained away kind of the way most teams explain away their playoff failures, which is, oh, well, it's random, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This stuff happens. And that's true. That is true. But there was also seemingly like the edge of a cliff waiting for this team. Counsell's contract was up. It was starting to seem a little bit like he wasn't going to come back. No one expected the Cubs to happen. Literally nobody. But it seemed like Counsell might be gone. He was integral to their success over the last 7-8 years. Corbin Burnes, everyone figured he was going to get traded. Who knew? No one knew what was up with Brandon Woodruff's injury. Devin Williams, who's still here, was possibly getting traded, a la Josh Hader a couple years ago. So there was this big question mark looming over the Brewers, which is kind of what makes what they're doing this year remarkable, surprising. Yeah. Like, I didn't see this coming from them. I'm not sure many people did.
I certainly did not. The Brewers come into this series with a plus 127 run differential, which is the best run differential in all of baseball coming into the series. They've obviously sort of run away with the NL Central, have been the far and away favorite there for a while. I guess just big picture, how are the Brewers doing this? Like, how on earth are the Brewers, more than 20 games over 500 and doing all of this after losing some key pieces?
I don't want to sell their like stars short, because the Brewers do have some really good players. Willy Adames is a really good player. William Contreras might be the best catcher in baseball. Jackson Chourio, I'm sure we'll talk about him. Devin Williams is still elite. But the Brewers do the thing they do is pitching development at the big league level. Their coaching staff is excellent. Chris Hook, the pitching coach, is at the forefront of that. They kind of turn guys like Tobias Myers, who we'll see this weekend, into a guy who goes from non-roster invite, was at AA last year, ERA in the 6s, like midway through last year at AA, to one of the better rookie starters in baseball. That's kind of what the Brewers do. And they, you could point to lots of guys on the roster that they've done this with. Jared Koenig, Brian Hudson, et cetera, et cetera. That's sort of their MO. And then they just play really good defense and don't really have it's not a great lineup, but it's not a bad lineup, which you can kind of use to win some games when your pitching and defense are pretty good.
Yeah, that was one thing that certainly stood out to me. I remember the narrative going into the postseason last year was that the Brewers just don't hit, at least not as much as a team that you would expect to hit in the postseason. Last year, I think they had a team-wide 91 OPS plus. This year, that number's up to 102, which is not, as you said, it's not like elite or anything, but it's a far and away improvement who are kind of the key pieces? I imagine this is where maybe we talk about Jackson Chourio. Sure. Who are the key pieces that are allowing this to happen?
Yeah, I mean, the offense is sort of predicated on not having any black holes, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Now, they do have some spots that are really struggling of late, like Sal Frelick has not been great. Bryce Terang has been slumping. Rhys Hoskins, who was their big offseason signing, has not
great.
delivered to this point. Like, there's still time for him to do what he's being paid to do in the postseason. But really, it's Chourio, it's Contreras, it's Adames on a nightly basis. Those are the three guys that are sort of carrying this offense and carrying this team. What Chourio's doing is remarkable. Started off the year really slow, and now he's a top 3 Rookie of the Year candidate. I think he's leading the league in hitting since June 1st or 2nd, or
wouldn't surprise me.
In that territory. Just got to 2020 last night, became the youngest player to ever get to 2020 in the major leagues. So there's a few guys right now that are doing a lot of the damage, and who knows what it'll look like in a couple weeks. But in the short term, if the Diamondbacks can get those 3 out specifically, it's very difficult for the Brewers to score runs right now.
I guess Pat Murphy is another big part of the offseason narrative for this team. Obviously, losing Craig Counsell to the Cubs, which I'm sure Brewers fans were not so happy about in the moment. I don't think that probably went over very well.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. But now Pat Murphy is the manager of the Brewers, and someone that maybe Dbacks fans are somewhat familiar with. Of course, he has a past at Arizona State, having coached there as well. What has it been like covering Pat Murphy as a manager here in his first year?
It's an experience.
Yeah,
it really is. It's so much different than, Craig Counsell's another guy that people here are familiar with. It's very different than that. I mean, they were together for 8 years, but their personalities, their management styles, both in game and in the clubhouse, completely different. I mean, Murph is one of one.
Yeah,
there is no one that's quite else like him, and his style, I wasn't necessarily sure it was going to work at this level. It's sort of like a college team, and I don't mean that in a bad way. But in some instances in the big leagues, that might not work.
Sure.
But with this team, it does work, and you certainly have to credit Murph for a lot of this team's success. Like, there's still areas where you see, he's a first-year manager, like in terms of in-game stuff. But you can't deny that when this team is exceeding expectations by this much, the way Murph has gone about it has to be a critical part of that.
Is there, I guess we'll dive in here to the starting pitchers for this series. The Diamondbacks have Eduardo Rodriguez going tonight against Freddie Peralta. It's Brandon Pfaadt and Tobias Myers on Saturday. And then Zach Gallen, who has moved up, will face DL Hall on Sunday. You mentioned Tobias Myers has been one of the best rookie starters in baseball this season. Freddie Peralta, D-backs fans may be a little bit familiar there from the postseason and in past years. And then DL Hall, a guy who seems to have really come on strong lately. What kind of stands out about those 3?
Well, Freddie's going to be the game 1 guy. It's been an up and down year for him.
Sure.
And that's not entirely surprising given his profile. He strikes out a lot of guys. He walks a lot of guys, gives up a lot of homers. Tobias Myers, we talked about a little bit. He might be in this playoff rotation as well. He's pitched really, really, really well. And then DL Hall's kind of the X factor, honestly, for this team moving forward. He will probably pitch out of the bullpen in the playoffs, some sort of abbreviated short-term stretch, but he's been hurt most of the year. He had the world's longest rehab assignment. I think it was like 3 months where there was one thing after another would pop back up, and he was just hanging out in Nashville for almost the entire season. The velo, you hear about this guy in the Corbin Burnes trade, right? And he's throwing 98. Oh, wow, this is interesting. And then he comes to spring throwing 92, and like, what's wrong?
Oh, wow.
So it's been a progressive season of getting healthy for him, and his stuff of late has looked the best it's been. It's looked like as advertised from DL Hall. And that's probably the Brewers' X factor. I don't think he's going to start in the playoffs, but he's going to pitch some big innings.
Diamondbacks have struggled against lefties recently. I imagine maybe that played a role in why Hall is starting in this series. I think the Diamondbacks sent out 2 sets of probables for the Brewers, and originally DL Hall was not included. Do you think that was like a change that they made, or was that maybe just a clerical thing and he was always
the Brewers are in a stretch? We'll have to ask about that today. It's a good question. Okay. The Brewers are in a stretch of playing 13 straight games.
Sure.
So no off days in there. End of the year, they've got this thing wrapped up maybe just get some innings out of DL Hall. He is stretched out, but the Brewers also stink against lefties. So
right, yes, we've heard that.
we might see that in play tonight.
I guess sticking with the starting pitching here, we talked earlier about how Corbin Burnes is no longer a member of this team, and that was obviously a really big move that the Brewers decided to make over the offseason. In retrospect, given how good this Brewers team has been, like, they could probably use Corbin Burnes, right? I mean, that would probably raise the ceiling of this team. Do you think there's a sense of regret that maybe the Brewers should have stuck by Corbin Burnes and brought him back for his walk here?
Regret? Probably not, because this is how the Brewers operate. They say it's how they have to operate. Whether you agree with that or not, it's the way they go about things. Remember when they traded Josh Hader a couple years ago? Now they've learned from that, and they don't do that in the middle of the season when they're in first place.
Yeah, that didn't work out. So well.
Notice how they kept Adames and they kept Devin Williams and all these other guys this year. It's difficult because, like, sure, the Brewers really could use Corbin Burnes this season, and their postseason outlook probably looks a bit different.
Yeah.
But also, where are they? You know, what's their third base picture look like without Joey Ortiz, who has been pretty solid at that position? And they're all about these repeated bites at the apple, they say, in the postseason. So eventually, theoretically, one of these years, if you keep getting there, it'll work out. It hasn't yet, so they're really putting that theory to the test in this last 5-6 year run. But no doubt this team would look a lot different, and that is a continuous ongoing debate. It's the same thing as the Hader deal. I mean, that loosely netted them William Contreras. They got Asturi Ruiz in that deal, and they flipped him for Contreras. So loosely, those two things were tied together, but they didn't make the playoffs in 22, and they tanked their season immediately after trading him. So these are the contentious debates in Brewers land, and I don't know what the answer is.
I imagine there would have been a full-on riot if the Brewers had traded Willy Adames at the deadline.
In the clubhouse,
yeah, and
in the stands,
in the stands
on Twitter,
well. Absolutely on Twitter. There's always a riot on Twitter, regardless of what's happening, basically. But I do want to talk about Willy Adames here because he's had an awesome season: 30 homers, 102 RBI, 18 stolen bases, an OPS right around 800. I feel like I know the answer to the question I'm about to ask. First of all, is there any chance that the Brewers are the team to pay him?
No, 98% no.
Okay, all right. So we got that part out of the way. Secondly, is Willy Adames about to make like $200 million? Like, what are we thinking?
I think that's the high end, like the high end of the reasonable expectation.
Okay.
Dansby Swanson contract is probably the fair comparison.
Yeah. You
look at kind of where they were when they reached free agency. Willy's honestly a better player than Dansby was at this point in their careers. His defense has been like sneaky bad this year.
Yeah.
Depending on which metric you use, but like watching them every day, it's like, oh, this is not what we're used to seeing from him. But yeah, still, you got a 28-year-old shortstop who just had 30 homers, 100 RBI.
Yeah.
Consistent performer. And also you can't say enough good things about him in the clubhouse. You know you're going to get a seamless transition and a leader. He's probably going to get paid. We never know how these baseball markets are going to work out, right?
Right.
The shortstop market a couple years ago was crazy with Story and Baez, or maybe that was 3 years ago. But then last year, not so much for a lot of guys. So we'll see if the market's hot, then Willy will be at the forefront of it. And if not, the Brewers will be sitting there with like a 3-year, 4-year offer for him if things don't work out.
So going into the playoffs, obviously the Brewers are gonna make it. I think we could pretty much safely say that at this point. They're on track to finish with a very similar record as what they had last year. Probably last year they were 92-70. Maybe they could finish a few games ahead of that. I'm curious, the 2024 Brewers versus the 2023 Brewers. Obviously, there's so much randomness involved in this, again, as we said earlier, but which of these teams do you think lines up better on paper for the postseason?
So on paper, I would have said last year.
Okay.
Especially going into the playoffs before we knew Brandon Woodruff was going to get hurt. I remember vividly, I don't know if you were in the room then, for his press conference when he walked in all teary-eyed after.
I was not.
They announced
not for that.
That was a memorable moment. He'd go from this guy starting game 2 to, oh yeah, he's out for like the next year.
Yeah.
So I would pick the Brewers on paper, but the one thing this Brewers team has going for them is something you can't really describe. It's just like a feeling, and that's sort of gets at the whole Murph part of the experience. Like you look at the roster, and they've got good players at the top, but it's not a great roster.
It doesn't scream best run differential in baseball.
No, exactly. No. And so they're getting there through we're 150 games into this. They've done this for 5.5 months somehow. I don't want to sell short like what they're good at, but if there's going to be a year where they kind of just like luck and vibes their way to it, it might be this year. But the roster is also not as good as even it was last year, in my opinion.
Huh. Well, it should be interesting to find out. We're going to get a whole lot of Dbacks-Brewers action here over the next 10 days. 7 games between these two teams in the next 10 days. Should be fun to watch. Obviously, 2 very good baseball teams that are both at least currently destined for the playoffs. I think the Brewers certainly in better position there than the Dbacks, but the Dbacks aren't in a bad spot in their own right. We'll see what happens. Curt, thanks again for hopping on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure.
We all silly like the mayor.